Well, Lewis will be back for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, so good news for him. Very quick recovery, and obviously he will have been looking, I think, with intense interest at everything George Russell did in his car while he was away. Mercedes have put out some quite interesting information post the Sakhir Grand Prix about a number of things, and we'll get onto those. But one of the most dramatic, I think, was that that start George made from the dirty side of the grid in Sakhir. It turns out that Valtteri actually didn't really make a bad start. Indeed, at the first Bahrain Grand Prix, he did a better job than Lewis. Lewis was on the pole, obviously, and Valtteri was on the dirty side of the grid. But in terms of getting the clutch right, Valtteri actually did a better job than Lewis. Lewis gave it too much, apparently. But obviously, still won the race. But equally, the next race, Sakhir, George Russell's start from the dirty side of the grid, just superb. And that was, it turns out, due to the data, that was purely reaction time, which is not a great thing for Valtteri Bottas to have to live with. I would have thought, for a Grand Prix driver, being beaten on reaction time is one of the most irritating things at which you can be beaten. It's the last thing you want to be beaten at. I mean, every racing driver worth his salt wants to think that he's got the best reactions in the business. And actually to be out-reacted off the line by a guy having his first start is not very nice. But that's not to say Lewis wouldn't have been out-reacted either, because it was just a great start by George. And Lewis has obviously made some pretty bad starts. He's got into some syndrome of bad starts, the yips, whatever you want to call it, over the years. So that was one thing. Another was, and this is, to me, this, call me one of the old guard if you like, but I did actually go through the ringer at Williams as team manager, so I kind of know what it's like, I think, under pressure. But looking at the drama that Mercedes had with the radio miscommunication, which led to the Keystone Cops type pit stop, and I'm quoting James Allison there in terms of the Keystone element, that was all because the radios that they have in the garage, for the mechanics specifically, are only able to take one frequency, basically. So they haven't got the ability to listen to both drivers or both sides of the garage simultaneously. It's got to be one or the other. And as James said it, this was a problem that Mercedes have had and have been lucky not to have encountered over the last 4 to 5 years. A very good point to have made, I think. But it finally came back to bite them in Sakhir, or finally bit them in Sakhir, in a race, of course, in which they've already clinched the championship, and Lewis wasn't racing anyway, and it was all relatively, in terms of damage limitation, it couldn't have been better, really. But anyway, the problem was this: you cannot have these two frequencies simultaneously, and what happened was that Ron Meadows was on the pit wall telling all the mechanics there was going to be a stacked pit stop, and as he was saying that, George Russell was talking to his side of the garage, including the mechanics, saying, am I coming in? I'm coming in now, whatever. And so 50% of the mechanics, all of whom were involved in the pit stop, didn't know that it was going to be a stacked pit stop. So that's why there was so much confusion. Now, the reason I was kind of smirking at the beginning of that explanation was because when I was at Williams as team manager, we definitely had the capacity with, we were with MRTC, Mercedes are with Rydell, we definitely had the capacity to have all the mechanics on the radio, but it would have been the same drama. They would have only have had one frequency. And I had several meetings with Patrick Head about that, and we both came to the conclusion, as did Frank, obviously, and the engineers, that given that, and given the propensity for potential errors, it was better not to have the mechanics on the radio at all, and to have the chief mechanic and obviously the race engineers giving instructions when necessary. And I've often thought that it's kind of taken for granted, isn't it, now, that everybody has to be on the radio, and all these radios everywhere, and all the mechanics are on the radio. And I often think back to Patrick Head and Frank saying, no, I don't want the mechanics on the radio. There's too much opportunity for confusion. They don't need to know anything other than the instructions we're going to give them. And that you can't fault that, actually. I think in modern times, you probably think, well, they're all whatever they are, garage technicians, car technicians, and therefore they should all know what's going on. They should be listening to the driver. But I think, there's a lot to be said for the Patrick Head, Frank Williams austerity there of just wait until we give you an instruction. And of course, if in that particular instance, there wouldn't have been a problem with the Mercedes stack pit stop had they had the Patrick Head, Frank Williams philosophy. So, and we obviously, the more radios you have, the more complicated it is, the more everybody knows everything that's going on, potentially the more chance of things going wrong when you have two bits of information coming out simultaneously. And that's kind of the Bernie Ecclestone philosophy of life, isn't it? You don't have an open plan office, you have lots of rabbit warrens and everybody gets on with their own thing and one person knows what's happening and he gives the instructions and then there's no room for error. So that was one point I wanted to make. The other one, and congratulations to Ferrari too, are starting to, for the first time in a long time, actually starting to talk about a few real issues. And just before this race, they put out a statement saying that they had to confess that their pit stops hadn't been very good this year. Like 20% of them have been longer than 3.4 seconds or something. I have to say, I wasn't aware of that. And if somebody said to me, have Ferrari been making terrible pit stops this year? Is it a reason for them not being great? I wouldn't have said that they were. But anyway, they said 20% of them have been below par. And they explained that by saying that there's been a problem with the threads on the wheel nuts, which aren't strong enough, in inverted commas. Quite what that means, I don't know. Probably means it's easier to cross-thread than it should be, I would guess. And because of that, the mechanics, which is a relatively new team of mechanics, 20 obviously involved in the pit stop, have been together for about 2 years now. And according to Ferrari, it's still not long enough for it to be a completely seamless, perfectly orchestrated pit stop. And they make the point that no other sport in the world do 20 human beings have to work in such perfect synchronization, which is an interesting comment to make as well. Anyway, so they said they're going to be working on these threads. And it reminded me again of the team manager days at Williams for me, when one of the first briefs I had from Patrick was to improve the Williams pit stops. And we only had, whatever it was, 8 guys on the pit stop at that stage. So we weren't talking 3.5, but we wanted to get it under about, from memory, comfortably under 8 in race conditions and practice it at sort of 6.5 to 7. And that was one of my briefs when I joined as team manager. And I looked at the whole situation and got in some uprights into the race shop, which were heated actually, simulated heated, which exactly the height, and we were able to practice the wheel change, the nut going on and off. But it turned out quite early on that one of the problems was that we were running much higher torque rates on the rear nuts, particularly compared with Benetton and Ferrari. And that went back to some extent to the wheel nut issue that Nigel Mansell had in Hungary in 87. And that point, the wheel nut torque rates have been increased. So I said to John Russell and David Brown, the two engineers, is there anything we can do about that? Because it's taking so long to just get the nut up to the right torque. And they said, oh, well, that's what it is, and we got to live with it. And anyway, to cut a long story sideways, the 2 cars that were beating us with pit stop were both designed by John Barnard, Patrick Head's friend stroke nemesis. And Nigel, who obviously was rejoining us from Ferrari, had a Ferrari 649 as one of his signing on stroke contractual payments. And he had it on display down at his Ferrari showroom at the time down in Hampshire. And so I sent John Russell down there with a micrometer to look at the back end of the Ferrari and just see exactly what they were doing with the rear uprights and everything else, to see how they were able to run presumably lower torque rates and thus had faster pit stops. So that's what we did. We went down with a micrometer to the back of the Ferrari, and basically the next Williams we did was revised at the rear end and had lower torque rates. So there we are. And the other thing, when James Allison was talking, and he uses lovely words like marauders when he's talking about the opposition, and controversial decisions when he's talking about whether or not they should have had a stacked pit stop. I love his phraseology. He really is very, very eloquent. He speaks like an RAF man, of course, which he is. His dad was a mega player in the RAF. Anyway, he was talking about pit stops and shortening times and all the rest of it, and it made me think of and how this had come back to bite them finally, and they're lucky that it hadn't come back to bite them when it was more important and the racing was more competitive. And it made me think of the pit stop drama we had with Nigel in Portugal when he was released from the pit with a loose rear wheel nut. And that was, I took responsibility for that as team manager. I was actually the lollipop guy, so in that sense I was the guy that released him with the unsafe car. But I'd just like to give you a little bit of background to that. Again, it comes under the heading of trying to make the pit stops as better than they were. And one of the things we did was eliminate one of the elements from the wheel changing process. So the car comes in, stops on the line, and there were no speed limits then, so standing there with a lollipop with the car approaching at 140 miles an hour was quite impressive always. So then the procedure was the car would be jacked up, the guns would go in, the guns would come out, the new wheels would go on, the guns would go in, and then the guns would go up in the air, and when I saw all 4 guns in the air, then the car was safe to release. And what we did was release the guns in the air element, because it just, saved a couple of seconds. And what happened was that, well, it's not funny really, but Nigel came in, and on the right rear there was a problem with the wheel, Ferrari type cross-threading problem with the wheel nut. And one of the mechanics, I won't mention him, then took the gun out to try and do it with his hand. And when the mechanic on the back of the car, and I won't mention his name, on the rear jack, saw the gun coming out, he assumed in his mind that wheel is clear, and then lowered the jack. Whereas in fact what he was doing was trying to get the gun out so he could get in with his hand to do it. And I at the front of the car just saw the rear jack going down, I saw the fronts clear and lowered the car, and there he went. So that was an example of shaving a system because we had some other issue with the car, i.e. the higher torque rates. We shaved the system to the point where, like Mercedes, it came back and bit us. And it just shows really, listening to James talking, that not much has changed. Obviously the technology has changed, but the systems and the way limits are pushed in Formula One are continually there has not really changed at all. And it could have been, listening to James, that could have been Patrick Head talking circa 1990, actually, in terms of everything that happened in that race in Sakhir. Couple of other things. The circuit is an interesting one, and some interesting stats have come out about, and I'm always interested in full throttle actually, because it kind of has a reflection on the nature of the circuit, tyre wear and everything else. And I was saying before Sakhir that it was 61% full throttle, or 62% I think, and it was not far behind Monza, which is 63%. Interestingly, some of the teams are saying that Abu Dhabi's 60%, but Mercedes are saying it's 61%, and I think that's all accurate, and I think that just shows how much quicker the Mercedes are, because the Mercedes simulation is showing that they are flat for 61% of the time, whereas most other cars are flat for only 59 or 60% of the time. and interestingly, even at 61%, it is the second lowest amount of throttle of all the circuits we've gone to this year, which show how quick all the circuits have been. The slowest has been Hungary, but the next is Abu Dhabi. And it's at 60% or 61%. I find that amazing. Because no Monaco, for example. Anyway, so that was one point. And the other thing about Abu Dhabi is the first sector. There's a lot of focus on the approach to the main straight, the hairpin, and that chicane at the end of the straight, and those corners in sector 3 where Artem Markelov passed 7 cars or something in 2 days. F2 a couple of years ago, so it is possible to overtake there in an F2 car, no matter F1. But I love Sector 1 in Abu Dhabi. It's a really quick couple of corners after the first one, and you don't see them. I don't think TV does them justice. They are really quick, and I think this year's cars will be very impressive through there. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. And the rest of the circuit to me is a bit sort of You know, it could be a lot better. There's some interesting corners, but they're not followed by long enough straights really to make them interesting. But I do love those I think it's turn 2, 3, 4 section. It's a good bit of road. So that's good. And the other thing is the first session on Friday and the FP3 on Saturday are both held during the day or the afternoon and won't have much relevance to the qualifying, which is going to be early evening, and the race, which is going to be early evening. So bear that in mind. And also that because of that, the teams will be running quite a lot of new stuff on the cars, I guess, in FP1, sort of 2021 stuff. So what happens in FP1 won't be particularly representative. And whether or not FP2 is representative remains to be seen, because there'll be a lot of 21 Pirelli tyre testing going on then as well. Then we'll get to FP3 and maybe the picture will be very different. And obviously then down to qualifying. A couple of other things. Chuck Yeager passed away this week. Big fan of Chuck Yeager, massive fan. Never met him. Spoke to Dan Gurney about him a lot. Love to have met him. And I think one of my all-time great regrets stroke frustrations was the 2007 Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne in March, around the third week of March. And it wasn't until the Monday morning that when I opened the paper and read that the Australian Air Show had taken place very near the track in Victoria at the Avalon airstrip. And guess who had been there all weekend, mainly just to do a talk on the Saturday night? Chuck Yeager. And I still find it incomprehensibly frustrating. I'm not going to use the word stupid because it's not appropriate, but frustrating that nobody in the higher echelons of Formula One had the gumption to invite Chuck Yeager to the Australian Grand Prix and to drive a course car around the front of the field before the start of the race or something like that. I mean, everybody in Formula One would have loved to have seen and met and paid homage to Chuck Yeager, absolutely for sure. And nobody cared, nobody did anything, and there he was, low profile, typical Chuck, at this air show. Australian Grand Prix was on at the weekend, and the whole thing was just forgotten about. And I thought it was just so sad, and I'm still irritated by it, even today by that. Anyway, I thought I'd pass that on. News out today that Matt Bishop, my friend and former editor-in-chief at F1 Racing, is joining Aston Martin Racing next year. That's the Stroll Racing Point was Force India team by any other name. So very best wishes to him. Couldn't have a better man, I don't think. He's really good. Communications director, which these days is an interesting job, I think. And I was sort of thinking about it in Mercedes terms this week, because Mercedes were putting surveys out with the media about their service to the press and so forth. And I sort of said to Mercedes, look, I don't know why you bother with the media at all, because you have your own media empire, and anybody who likes Mercedes, Formula One, Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas, George Russell is going to go to your YouTube channel, to all your social media platforms, to your websites. They're not going to go anywhere else, because your stuff is so much better than anybody else's, because you are Mercedes. You're right there in the heart of it. And I think that is what, I mean, I predicted this years ago when I was trying to get Williams to do their own TV channel. Yeah, it never happened. But yeah, to me, that is the future. Mercedes basically have their own media empire. For sure, Racing Point stroke Aston Martin will, now that Matt is there. They do already, but it'll become a much bigger, more polished thing with Matt there. And so it goes on. You know, every Formula One team will effectively be a TV company in its own right. And with the media, you know, I'm not sure what role the media plays anymore, as I say, because if you love Ferraris, you're going to go to Ferrari stuff. If you love Racing Point, Aston Martin, you're going to go there, aren't you? And that is the way Formula One is. And no other sport is like that, really, apart from soccer and the major football teams have YouTube channels and stuff and TV channels, but not much else. I mean, there's not a sort of Novak Djokovic TV channel, is there? It's just tennis. But, you know, Formula One is really all about the teams. I've always made that point. You know, that's why an IMG, Mark McCormack, driver management agency would never work in Formula One, and has never worked, even though they've tried it a few times, because ultimately it's the teams that have the power. There's no outside entity that can have the power. It belongs with the teams, because they have the money and they therefore have the control over everything, the drivers, the media, everything else, and the content of the media. So it's an ever-changing world. Matt Bishop, to me, is one of the guys right in the front of that in terms of communications and making things happen for the, dare I say, the partners of the team, who benefit enormously from the penetration that modern media, digital media, allows them. And Matt is a purveyor of that, if you like, and that's why he would be so good at a team like Aston Martin and where they're going with the new frontiers. Anyway, we're doing the usual range of videos, Friday, Saturday, Sunday from Abu Dhabi, and it's going to be brilliant as ever. See you then.